Hi, and welcome to the Digital Digging YouTube channel. In this episode of Pilot's Notes, we'll be taking a look at the Terrifying Typhoon, both in real life and in the game of War Thunder. In 1938, the Hawker Siddeley Company began work on an aircraft which would meet the criteria of the Air Ministry specification F-18/37, which requested a fighter that could achieve or exceed 400 miles per hour or 644 kilometers per hour at 15,000 feet or 4,600 kilometers, was powered by a British engine and was armed with 12 7.7mm Browning machine guns to hold 500 rounds each. The chief designer, Sidney Cam, had 4 engines to choose from: the Bristol Centaurus, the Rolls-Royce Griffon, the Rolls-Royce Vulture and the Napier Sabre. For reasons best known to himself, Cam decided to go with the last two, even though their most obvious qualities were their complexity and lack of reliability. Consequently, 2 versions of the prototype aircraft were developed: the Type R, or Tornado, which was powered by the Rolls-Royce Vulture, and the Type N, or Typhoon, which was powered by the Napier Sabre. Development of the Type R was abandoned quite early on in its brief existence when Rolls-Royce gave up on the Vulture, an engine which they would later remember as being one of the worst they ever produced. This left the Hawker Siddeley Company with just the Typhoon to concentrate on, which, without doubt, needed all the attention it could get. In the early days, it terrified the pilots as much as the enemy, as during its development and the time it took to iron out its teething troubles, it was apt to poison you, explode, or, if you were lucky enough to get it off the ground, part company with the entire tail section with very little warning. In fact, Philip Lucas, the test pilot who first experienced the often lethal structural failures, was awarded the George Medal for managing to bring a rapidly disintegrating prototype back to Earth. Cam had decided to repeat the success of the Hurricane and once again decided on a thick, heavy wing in order to create a steady gun platform. This unfortunately rendered it unsuitable in the role of high-altitude dogfighter for which it had been intended. Moreover, the Sabre engine had a disappointing rate of climb and also failed to perform well at altitude. Once the universally disliked car door arrangement for pilot access was swapped for a bubble hood, and the 12 7.7mm machine guns were replaced with 4 20mm Hispano-Suiza cannon, and the fuselage had been reinforced to dissuade the rear half of the aircraft from going off on its own adventures, we were more or less left with the Typhoon 1B. The Typhoon had almost been abandoned on a number of occasions, but it eventually excelled in 2 areas. Troublesome or not, the 24-cylinder Sabre engine generated a maximum speed of 412 miles per hour or 664 kilometers per hour, and was found to be perfect for chasing and catching the German fighter bombers which had been plaguing the south coast of England and, unless they were caught red-handed, getting away with it. Now suddenly on their way home they would find themselves being closed in upon by a beast of a machine which was fully capable of knocking them out of the air. The second role it excelled in, much like its predecessor the Hawker Hurricane, was as a ground attack aircraft. The thick strong wing was ideal for carrying a mixture of ordnance, and the 20mm cannon could also make short work of unarmoured targets. It could carry up to 8 rockets with 60 pounds or 27 kilo warheads, or 8 of the lighter 25 pound or 11 kilo armour piercing rockets. Alternatively, it could carry a pair of 500 pound or 226 kilo bombs, with later versions doubling that. In this capacity, the Typhoon turned the tables on the Germans, and by 1943 was disrupting supply lines and destroying targets of opportunity throughout northern France. In August 1944, during the Battle of the Falaise Pocket, widely acknowledged as the decisive engagement at the Battle of Normandy, the Typhoons of the 2nd Tactical Air Force managed to knock out 175 enemy tanks in a single day. We have 3 of these aircraft in the game: the 1A, the 1BL and the 1B Premium. The Tier 2 1A, as in real life, is armed with 12 7.7 Brownings and can also carry up to 1,000 pounds of bombs. Like its real life counterpart, the machine guns are reasonably effective at chewing up an enemy aircraft, but you really need the 20mm to make any impact. The Tier 3 1B Premium certainly does that and also carries a 1,000-pound bomb load, but for me this aircraft really comes into its own when you unlock the Tier 3 1BL, which in addition to the 1,000-pound bomb load has 8 152mm rockets and an extra 21 miles per hour or 32 kilometers per hour over the 1B, which brings the top speed up to 411 miles per hour or 660 kilometers per hour. Right, that's probably enough background information for one video. The next part is in the words of the pilots who flew the real thing. First of all, we hear from Flight Lieutenant Johnny Colton of the Royal Canadian Air Force and who flew with 137 Squadron. The following words are his. To start this monster, the Typhoon pilot had to set the throttle to 5/8 of an inch open and no more. Otherwise there was a real risk of drowning the carburetors in gasoline with a resulting engine fire. The ignition of the 24 cylinders, using what was called a Kaufman system, was effected using a shotgun-style cartridge. As the cartridge exploded, the propeller rotated around 450 degrees. At that point, with the cylinders full of gasoline, it was a must for the engine to start successfully, or it had an 80% chance of catching fire at the next attempt. The fuel had a very high octane rating at this stage of the war. The Typhoon used only 130 octane grade gas. Before starting the engine and during the flight, the pilot was obliged to wear an oxygen mask because the cockpit immediately filled with carbon monoxide exhaust. The Napier Sabre engine had an awesome decibel output, sounding nearly 5 times louder than a Merlin. The vibration caused by this beast was quite disconcerting to an inexperienced pilot. Whilst taxiing, it was recommended not to abuse the brakes to avoid heating them and consequently decreasing their effectiveness. At the hold position, the pilot had to run up the engine to 3,000 revs per minute to clear the cylinders. At startup and during taxi, the engine would spit plenty of hot oil, but the mechanic, who often guided the pilot by sitting on a wing, learned to have a cloth handy to wipe the windshield before the pilot took off. It was better not to wait too long before taking off, as the engine heated up quickly, easily reaching a temperature of 95 degrees centigrade. With a massive propeller powered by the equally massive Sabre, the power on takeoff was phenomenal, the torque being so strong as to frighten any unwary beginner pilot. On the takeoff roll, the aircraft would veer violently to the right, even with the rudder pedal fully depressed left. It was only with the proper rudder trim and the right mix of power that pilots were able to keep the aircraft straight, the ailerons not being affected below 93 miles per hour. The flak that we experienced, you've heard the expression, it was so thick you could walk on it. It was just black and we suffered quite a few losses. We would start our dive at 6,000 feet and we'd be getting close to 500 miles per hour before we released the rockets and pulled out. On the way down we had 88mm anti-aircraft guns firing at us at 5,000 or 6,000 feet, then 37mm, then 20mm as we got lower and closer to the target. Then on the way out it was 20mm, 37mm and then 88mm in that order. They didn't have too hard a time picking off the boys. At that speed we were doing, when we pulled out, you could easily black out for 2 or 3 seconds, and when you came round you were often facing straight up. Frequently when I got back to the base, the airframe mechanic would say to me, "You know, the rivets are pulled in the wings here, what happened?" This occurred quite often. The rivets would come loose from the stresses of the G-force. The following is from Squadron Leader Basil Gerald Stapleton, Typhoon pilot with the 247 and 257 squadrons. The first thing that struck me when I climbed into a Typhoon was that you had to get used to the height you were sitting at. On takeoff, the Typhoon swung the opposite way to the Hurricane and the Spitfire, so we had to unlearn that, which had become second nature to us. Early Typhoon takeoffs were nearly always in a climbing turn. The Typhoon was far more powerful than the previous aircraft I'd flown. On an early flight I achieved 400 miles per hour on the clock at sea level. It really was a tremendous ground attack aircraft. The cannons were devastating for soft-skinned targets such as vehicles. If there was grass around the targets, it was like a wave when the shells hit the ground and the turf seemed to ripple in retreat. There was no recoil when firing rockets. Having sighted the target, I lined up, dived, started pull-out and fired just as soon as it disappeared under the nose of the aircraft. Using this method, I reckoned I couldn't miss. I found it best to stay low after an attack and utilise the speed to get away from the target rather than attempting to climb away. This seemed to work, and when I came down in December 1944 I wasn't shot down. I suppose I shot myself down when I flew through the debris of the locomotive I'd attacked with my rockets. And finally we'll finish with the words of Squadron Leader Des Scott of the Royal New Zealand Air Force, Typhoon pilot with 198 and 486 squadrons. Should the Typhoon's temperamental engine stop in the air, you were faced with 2 alternatives: over the side or the gliding angle of a 7-ton brick. In a forced landing, it was apt to somersault and either crush the pilot or explode. So even in later life, the Typhoon had very mixed reviews. Well, I hope you enjoyed that. If you did, then please hit the like button, it all helps the channel, and if you're not subscribed, you might wish to take this opportunity to hit the relevant button too. As usual, there'll be a transcript of this video with embedded documentary videos and links to further resources over at the main digital digging website. You can find the link in the description box below. Right, cheerio chaps, and hope to see you next time. Bye bye.